Hello, and welcome to Kanban for Everyone. I'm your host, Colleen Johnson, the CEO of ProKanban.org, and today I'm joined by James Gifford. James, you want to take a moment to introduce yourself to our audience?
Hi, I'm James Gifford. Um, I do a lot of different things, kind of an agile practice leader for a financial institution in the great state of Pennsylvania. Been doing this stuff for, about 13 years now. Just kind of flow obsessed. Really looking forward to, chatting with you all.
Flow obsessed. That'll be our next round of stickers. Well, in this series of Kanban for Everyone, we're actually taking a slightly different approach than how we talked about Kanban for Everyone last year, where we were doing interviews with different types of teams and different types of work. And this year, we want to talk about how Kanban can be applied to different areas of our process or different practices that are already in place to really make them better, more visible, more efficient, and more predictable. So, we're kicking off today talking about product discovery. James, I would love if you could kick us off by telling us more about what product discovery means. It can be some different things to different organizations and different parts of the process. So let's start there. What is product discovery?
Uh, a bunch of buzzwords that people use to, sell books and things like that. No, I mean it really just depends on like your context. Like product discovery could be just clearing up a lot of uncertainty in a direction or an idea that you have. Um, People often like exclude services, but services can be treated just like a product as well. So like if you could just replace the word product discovery with service discovery, it's all about finding that you know right solution, solving problems. It's less about the methods. It's more about what problem are you trying to solve and understand so that you can make the best decision possible. If you've got a bunch of, legacy or like existing UI elements and you're calling it product discovery, then really you're just doing refinement. So like this is really about the exploration of the unknown and trying to bring more certainty into what we're doing from a product, from a service, from anything that your company may, you know, turn into value for their customers.
Yeah, and I mean, in some organizations, a discovery practice or process doesn't exist at all, right? Or it's kind of kept behind closed doors, even where decisions are made, things are placed on a roadmap. We don't really understand how they got there. So even the first step of this is probably pulling back the curtains on this a little bit to say what product discovery practices do we even have in place, and how do we start to make that process more visible to the organization. When you think about common things you've seen, not let's not start with Kanban, but what other things have you seen organizations use to manage the product discovery process?
So, I mean, a lot of folks, like, depending on if, like you'll talk to a large consulting firm and they'll tell you that design thinking is, the bee's knees for product discovery. So you'll go out and pretend to implement like design thinking as a solution. Um, but design thinking is a tremendous way to solve problems if you need to be client centric. If you want to do rapid prototyping, you're not good at having a process because design thinking kind of gives you the double diamond and the series of steps to kind of work through. And there's enough information out there online to really take you through it. But I've also seen companies use things like domaic. So like for all the agile people that just passed out and died because I brought up Lean Sigma 6, sorry. But like there's domain projects in the Lean Sigma 6 process. Like if you're trying to, in your discovery, trying to remove a significant amount of waste from a product line that you have existing. So if you're producing tangible goods, like you may have designed a printer that isn't serviceable in the field, and it's costing the people that are, the resellers and people like that, thousands of dollars to go maintain that piece of equipment because of a bad design. You may need to go back and do product discovery on that to make the next generation better, or potentially implement a tool or fix that then eliminates that waste that you've introduced for that company so that they're back to being happy. And the just the data driven aspects of Lean Sigma 6 and to make projects be an effective use tools to do that. We've seen a lot of that, and then just a whole lot of just willy nilly shenanigans.
It's a technical term.
Mhm.
So I think when we think about product discovery, where we often see a lot of organizations get stuck in how to manage that process too, is that it's not as maybe as linear as some of the other things where things might move from development to test to deploy. We have this kind of giant feedback loop, right? Where we might test something, experiment with something, and then need to go back to the drawing board on that. So I think that presents kind of an interesting challenge when we start to talk about how Kanban or a definition of workflow comes together with product discovery. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've approached managing that kind of almost a circle of a workflow through a Kanban system?
Well, any of you that have been around me for a long time, you know I've had probably more weird jobs than we can shake a stick at. And I spent a lot of time working in marketing, doing creative design, different elements like that. And it's when you start to really think about these processes where everything is a feedback loop, it is iterative. Like there was an original scope that you were trying to deliver on, like that initial idea, while it may evolve multiple times. If you're working with like a marketing agency or even like somebody that does like digital media production, like videos, training courses, things like that for you, you're going to have that initial statement of work. When they present it to you and you give them feedback and say, hey, not quite right, but if we tweak it like this, we could definitely want to see it again. Well, they're going to close that initial body of work, and then they're going to add an AA to the original statement of work, effectively taking what you had, saying we're going to change it, and then proceeding it through the process again. So when we set up a lot of workflows for product discovery, we like to teach teams to use that AA process as a mechanism to manage the work. That way you also have track of the number of iterations something could have gone through. So you then have another data point of as we have people engaging in the discovery process, did we bring enough information to the party? Were there things that we could have done to been closer to potentially that problem state? It gives us another data point to go back and then reflect on.
Can you tell us what you mean by AA process?
So an AA process, I forget what the AA stands for, but it is basically an amendment to your contract. So you do a statement of
Okay.
work that is a fixed body of scope, the same way you would with a consulting company. So if you are engaging in a consulting group to do your agile transformation, you're going to write that original statement of work with these like 5 things that we need to solve. They're going to deliver on those, but through the course of those deliveries, they may change the scope of your work and add a 6th item, 7th item, which then that means, what we quoted you before isn't what you're going to pay at the end.
Okay, so you're talking, and when you're talking about that discovery process, you're talking about that services side, it sounds like. So, going through the process of identifying what the services are, getting feedback on those things, folding them back in. Um,
But
and you're saying,
even if I was taking like a feature in a mobile app through that process, and we were doing a lot of discovery on like the need for video chat in my, my banking app, like the discovery of that, we would have started out with an original scope and discovery that would have needed to happen. There would have been a defined research, potentially a target population. We would have gone through like UI, sketches, things like that, and brought that out for feedback. That original body of work would have been kind of that first kind of ticket in the system.
okay, I see what you're saying. So
Subsequent,
yeah, new iterations or new experiments come on as new work items to
yep,
keep
and
things
then
moving. Okay. And then how about, so we're kind of drifting a little into batch size, it sounds like, or how big are the tickets on our board or in our Kanban workflow here. So when you start thinking about discovery work, what makes a good, like, how do you define that work well, right? It's very open-ended. We probably don't necessarily have acceptance criteria. How do you make sure that those work items don't just get stuck and stay open forever?
I mean, there are potentially time and market. Like, so if you know like your constraints, like if you know that there is a window of time that you need to have this in market to not miss that opportunity, that's one of those situations where it makes it a lot easier to kind of deal with. It goes back to some of the, I think we teach it in we teach it in the APK when we do the penny game, and at the end we kind of debrief on like batch size of you and I are standing right next to each other. So like single piece flow makes a whole lot of sense. But if you're 50 feet on the other side of the room, single piece flow isn't going to make sense. I think you need to optimize your batch size based on kind of need and demand, while balancing the fact that like the average cost of a development team in the US could be anywhere from 2.5 million to $4 million a year. So if you have a lengthy discovery process and they're waiting on that to do delivery, you're incurring that cost of them being there, and they're also doing potentially lower value work. So you need to kind of build your discovery process around being able to feed those product teams. So I'm going to say it depends. But like we know that, like, so in an organization that is, we're on a common clock, you're working to we do some big room planning, different elements of that. So if you're kind of in that situation where you're potentially PI planning and you want to get this into the next increment to deliver, then like understanding how soon the product team would need to engage you to then get it ready to then make that PI also kind of helps with some of those constraints. And for one of the product families we've worked with, or product groups we've worked with, like it's pretty good that like from start to finish their like discovery process is 55 days at the 85th percentile. And that is
Okay.
good because that allows us to really understand when and we need to pull things. So if it does need discovery, we know that we need to start engaging them roughly about 55 days ahead of when we would
Oh,
do
that's
this.
interesting.
So that allows you to then
Yeah, so
back in this, you're backing in the dates and things like that. But if you know their SLE and they
right.
have a general understanding of some of the outliers that have been like significantly longer, then with a lot of confidence, it's like, okay, as a product person or a business person needing to potentially bring a new idea to the team, understanding that SLE is 100% valuable in your ability to bring things into your planning cycles, if you're doing that type of kind of planning.
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about what you've seen for things that contribute to those outliers or the things that are taking longer than 55 days, what kind of things tend to cause discovery work to get stuck?
So one of the things that like, and it kind of, it's one of those annoying things for me is just like if you have a lack of vision, and because you have a lack of vision or just like you're kind of weak in your ability to prioritize work, there's a lot of churn that's introduced.
Uh-oh.
Uh, or my back was clocking there
Yeah,
for a
there we
second.
go.
All right.
Yeah, we lost you
So
right as you said there's a lot of churn introduced.
So if you have a lot of churn introduced into your backlog, so there's a lot of volatility in your strategy or your vision or just continuously shifting priorities, what ends up happening is you now have a lot of work in flight. And so people may have started some discovery work and then now you've like land yachted that thing, or you need to like descope and kill. But like some of these outliers are typically things that got stopped because somebody had an idea, we started it, and then we were like, oh, no, 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 the priorities have changed, we need to start this, and then end up with a lot of kind of orphaned items that are artificially aged because we stopped working on them to go chase another idea, instead of realizing that if we waited 15 more days based on our service level expectation, it would have just been done and we could have started that next item. And in the grand scheme of a lot of these decisions, like 15 days wasn't going to kill us. Nobody was going to jail. Nobody was going to die. We weren't going to be fined $3 million. It wasn't really a priority to start it right there and then. And it goes back to like those weak prioritization frameworks. Other things around those outliers, it just could have been really poorly defined. The customer segment that we had originally took as like the target population, it could have just been really wrong. And then so it got stuck because you couldn't find the results. Or in the case of some of these companies, if you're a company that isn't selling digital services like a product, a mobile app, you may have limited access to your customers to actually be able to validate those items, or have access to them. So like if you're dealing with like, super affluent people, most likely they're not going to have time to like actually sit down with you and give you product feedback. Or, so like you may need to do incentive programs to like bring in actual feedback. Imagine that you have to pay for feedback, but in reality, like we've had to do that at a number of companies. Like we worked with a company that was rebuilding their ecom platform. We knew that the ecom platform, you can't just drop one of those in and incrementally release it if your risk appetite is like, if you don't have the right level of risk appetite. So they made the decision, we're going to do this thing and we're going to release it all at once and like just relaunch the ecom platform. All right, well, you need to get feedback. And to do that, we paid the pharmacists that we're going to use the ecom platform to come to the development center every 6 weeks on a rotation. There were 60 pharmacists and their staff that we paid money. We flew them into Pennsylvania. They worked in they actually worked in the pharmacy that we built and used the software. And then we would debrief on it and they would give us feedback like that. So that was an instance where we knew we were going to have a hard time getting feedback, the right feedback. We had to make that decision to pay for it to then keep things moving forward.
Okay. And in that case, so thinking about your example of the 55 days is your SLE, for example, for work like this. When you think about the visibility of how long things are taking at each stage of your workflow, this is a great example, right? There's like a wait time in this while the experiments are being run. What kind of information becomes important about those individual stages of the discovery workflow in I don't, maybe a daily stand up or maybe these aren't daily, right? When the work takes a little bit longer, but what kind of information is coming back to the group about those stages?
So we kind of organize things in those bigger bodies of work. We'll use a larger kind of increment or like an epic, and then use a set of tickets to then manage some of the experiments. But the epic is written in a way that it is in the form of an experiment. Oftentimes back when the lean startup movement was just going off like gangbusters, I have this old PowerPoint template that I can never remember where I got it from, but it's just been with me for like kind of like my hat for longer than I can remember where I bought it at. And so like we'll try to make sure that the epic is structured in a way that has like the call out of the experiments, the value proposition, what does success look like, what are the failure metrics look like, what do we hope to validate in our learnings, and then we work to then satisfy those through tickets, and some of that tickets may be directly to like data work, experience work, technical work that could be the results of prototypes and things like that. And because you have all those child items, the individual teams or organizations can use those and manage them. And because you're able to see progress at the lower levels on a daily basis, you can then kind of watch where items are on the upper level. Because if you within an epic, while that is in that kind of refinement or like the execution of that particular body of work, because if the experiments are success, we don't necessarily shut down that ticket right away. It could go potentially directly into execution for like delivery to customers.
Yeah.
We built the workflow to kind of bypass, like it could be like we researched it and it's going on the shelf, or we researched it and we're just going with it. because you're able to do
Even
that,
what you're, oh, sorry, go ahead.
because you're able to now see that in the epic. So like it, we use the if you go and if you've seen our ASPK class, we talk about a workflow where we have you have problem understanding and then solution exploration kind of called out as some key elements in the discovery process. We can see when an item needs to go, like where it is in there, where it's gone from the understanding to the solution to like potentially feasibility, um, and the lower level items kind of progress through those states. So we can always see progress, but we actively do flow management on that epic level item or board on a biweekly cadence. So like every 2 weeks,
Okay.
it's a sprint. That's when the sprints end. Most of the teams are doing Scrum. We've kind of tied those time boxes to the Scrum time box because it helps calculate. It simplifies your metrics calculations and keeping track of throughput, different elements like that.
You mentioned, well, and I wanted to backtrack a little when you were talking about the what makes it through based on the metrics. And I think that data becomes so interesting because what a lot of organizations do as they start to roll out any kind of discovery process, I feel like we see kind of discovery theater taking place where it's like we're going to run all these experiments on epics or features that we're considering building, but they're already on our roadmap to deliver this year. So nothing leaves. Nothing really gets kicked out of the discovery funnel. So I think it's interesting too to think about how do you leverage that data to make sure that um, you're anchoring some of that decision making in the data that you're getting back, the quantitative and qualitative research. I saw somebody was mentioning that in the chat too. So how do you make sure that that data is what's driving the decision making, and that it's not just stuff in the discovery funnel for the funnel's sake?
Well, everything needs discovery. Like every now, it's like so I've kind of shied away from like the traditional scaling models, and I've just become like scaling with Kanban enables you to really have that kind of portfolio level view. You can nest them all the way down through, and flight level or flight levels kind of has spans of control across those. I didn't know that was a thing until I picked up the book after somebody said that's what I was doing. But when you really look at it, like there are multiple highways into every single team, whether it's at the broader organization, like, or it could be that layer of the portfolio. We've established policies around like what are those criteria that say like this warrants discovery. So like having a policy built into the board that when work comes into the system, if you run through the list and it kind of checks off on the uncertainty boxes, it's, well, we don't know enough about it. It isn't currently actively planned in our roadmap. Then it gets through and put into that kind of discovery cycle. So we built it into the actual policies in the board
Yeah.
around the column, and then structuring it around those templates. Like we're in there actually defining the metrics. And through sometimes some of those ideas die on like researching the customer segment base. Like we thought we were going to do this. Well, there isn't actually enough clients in that kind of demographic that we want to hit that like it even makes it viable to do this. It'll cost us more to do an experiment than it will and deliver it than it will the value will return in the amount of time.
Who typically is participating in Kanban at this level? So what kind of roles are involved?
It really just depends on kind of your organizational structure. If it's like when we talk about like feature roadmap, we in a lot of companies today, you're going to start to see that like less style, like chief product. It's not chief anymore. Anyway, like the product owner of product owners, if you will, like so they may be looking out for that roadmap. Um, if work's coming in at that level, generally it's that person kind of sitting down and doing that evaluation. But we've set the same kind of policies at the local board, at the next layer up board, and then at the broader portfolio as kind of a pattern. Because then everybody has a consistent definition of discovery, You just may have thresholds on like span of control and like final decisioning rights, depending on like your organization's appetite for like locus of control
Yeah.
and things like that, like the red tape machine.
I see some questions starting to come in from our audience here, and Kevin was commenting on that conversation around how work makes it to the actual team. So, how are features or functionality prioritized into actual work? You want to talk through that at all?
It prioritization is a one of those kind of gray areas for everybody. I'm just going to say that WSGIF rules all things, and just run
No.
away in shame. Um, like so, like it just. I like to keep it simple. I like to set priorities. It would start with, there's a Luma template out there. If you've been exposed to Luma, it's like design thinking templates and things like that. Mural just bought them, so like that should drive more customers to them because Luma's big money. Um, but like it's the importance difficulty matrix. So like it's a great way to then sit down and actually talk about how hard is it, um, versus how important it is to folks. And so like you can basically relatively structure that, and then the second portion of that exercise is then you throw up the four-way box, and then there's a sweet spot over here that it's ultimately like, hey, you should go after this and prioritize it because of its importance and the level of effort. We have seen everything from like the Hoshin matrix that you would find in like traditional lean and how it ties to your organizational outcomes versus all your your subdivisions, things like that. um, 9 boxes, cost of delay. The problem with prioritization is like you got to kind of find out what works for your organization. um, some companies prioritize for value and just like pure profitability on like, is this idea going to bring us a bunch of cash or solve that CSAT problem that, I worked at a company where the product itself had 15% customer growth every single month, but their attrition rate, 15%. So the product literally made no money because they had a CSAT problem, but they had a great growth curve. So it was like, well, we need to figure out what CSAT, what do we need? What are the top CSAT items that we need to remediate to then make this thing actually profitable? So we can get back to doing good things. So like that was the primary driver of like prioritization was, hey, they want new features, but unless we can actually get this thing, unless we can get this ship turned around, like we're never going to make any money. And this development center is like, it's a no win
Yeah.
situation. So they started with
Well,
their
and
prior.
yeah, some of that's kind of managed through your workflow policies too, right? And I think like what you're describing there, it's a lot of times, again, this is something that kind of happens behind closed doors, and you don't know, did the idea get killed? You mentioned a bunch of different reasons why work may not make it to the team or may not get prioritized, but a lot of times we have no visibility into that. And so I think the teams doing the work may not see that that experiment is taking place, or they might not understand that the idea was vetted and never met the criteria to move forward. And I think even just starting to implement Kanban at this level starts to create that visibility, right? So being able to say, for the last quarter, these are all the experiments we ran and killed, or the work's not moving forward, is an important thing for the teams to have that conversation about too, because otherwise it feels like maybe that's not happening, or the reasons why things didn't move forward aren't being shared. So I think that working this way in this space can start to help connect a lot of those dots for the teams doing the work.
It 100% does. Like the having visibility into like, I don't subscribe to the whole classes of service thing. Like work is work. Like there is no reason to classify it into the different classes of service, but there is a significant value into understanding what your work makeup is, and then shifting that distribution of work and as a prioritization mechanism too, especially if you're having challenges where you have a culture that potentially was super innovative, and then like then there's like a big push for something new or a tech stack change, and then it all just becomes, stale and humdrum. And then it's all showing up in your employee sat because they're like, oh, the culture of this company died. We were so innovative and we experimented a lot. Being able to bring back visibility to the number of experiments that people are running, that they are active there, even if they're dying on the vine, it
Yeah.
does show that we are trying to innovate. It does show that experimentation is happening. And you want to make that visible, especially if it's something that showed up in your employee satisfaction survey.
Yeah. That kind of ties to what Stephen was saying here around other forms of value, right? Other value aspects. Employee satisfaction can definitely be a factor there. Rachel posted a question here. What is a general pattern for estimating higher level of epics and initiatives? Because that might be different than estimating user story level of work, which may change the roadmap and elongate time for delivery. So slightly different, maybe a slightly different when we're talking discovery. What kind of things are you using to estimate?
Oh, story points. It's just the be all end all of that, estimation and forecasting. I, it really, for me, like we will t-shirt size things in the beginning. We give them ranges, kind of. We don't do anything that, we want things to be more probabilistic. When you're t-shirt sizing, it's pretty much a guess, but we do try to find patterns of items that were delivered, do some retrospectives. So at least you can have on your screen the actual card that you did deliver and the retrospected, like validated sized story. But as teams get more data and we have more data in the system, I do try to push folks more towards the probabilistic forecast, and really taking advantage of Monte Carlo. But you got to get enough data there to actually make use of it. And it's easy to get a lot of data for the team level stuff. The epic level, depending on your ability to deliver things, it could take you 6 months to get enough data to like semi-reliably use that as a forecast. But everything that we do is always a range and a confidence vote. Even if I am stuck using story points, we will take whatever the teams put in for their estimate and give you three options. And then based on how the team's feeling confidence wise, a two's a one, a two's a three. So you build your schedule, all the tickets that come out, you put it down, and then if you're really uncomfortable, you go to the pessimistic curve, which takes you out to 18 months from now. The optimistic one is like 9 months. Yes, the estimate's double, but it's, effectively, that's what you have to do. Even if you're using Monte Carlo, you do need to have some level of a range and confidence in your estimate. I think
It
Dan
sounds like
and
Andy would like you to use lines of code, and maybe you could also create a lines of code range for each story point value. Do you think that would be more predictable? I'm just kidding. Never do that.
never do that. But fingers on keyboard time. Some of this stuff too is like, you know, when we look at when I generally help teams and look at estimates and different kind of forecasting things, how much pressure are you getting from your organization on, like, is it like the 100% utilized, you got to look busy at all times kind of organization, or hey, it's okay to not plan to 100%, and if you finish early, you can always pull something in, nobody's going to yell at you. um those are the kind of situations where, like, I'm also going to give some different guidance as well. Like, there's some organizational culture aspects that just can destroy you, either way.
Yeah, and I think what we're talking about from a discovery perspective too is understanding what your organization's capacity is. So really, WIP limits are a way that we're managing how much work we have against how much capacity we have. And so at the discovery level, I've often seen that for product discovery folks, whoever's doing this work, right? You called out different roles within a product organization, but when we think about product discovery, it's often not like a one-to-one for every team that needs new work to pull. And so capacity is typically very limited for doing all these experiments, yet we're trying to jam 10 pounds of experiments into a 2 pound bag for the team's capacity here. So managing WIP here becomes really important too. I'm
It,
seeing a bunch of new questions for you, James. Oh, go ahead. You want to talk WIP limits for
well,
a
I think
moment?
I think it's really interesting because you may have an experiment that may go through your user experience group, and you're going to have those content writers that are super good at writing content but may not be good at writing design, like doing designs. You're going to have designs, wireframes, and all those kind of things. You do see generally some more specialist style kind of roles, like in groups, do it like in client experience groups. We've been really focused on building their workflow as like things would potentially progress, so that way you can have WIP limits and understand that constraint of like, hey, we only have 2 content writers available for this particular line, and so you need to have the policies in place so that the content writers can write good quality content, which then made us realize that maybe we have too many designers on this because everything keeps piling up at the limited resources of the content group, or we need to find some
So
more content people.
Kevin posted here, I believe what we're talking about is is a discovery of a brand new product, not necessarily iterating on something that already exists. Is it fair to ask specifically, how can I use Kanban to get to MVP?
I think that is it is a viable question. I can tell you back in 2016 when Mike McCalla and I were sitting around trying to get the LAI off the ground, which is Lean Agile Intelligence for any that don't know that, there were a lot of things that we were managing on a Kanban board to get to those initial prototypes, from sourcing a team to like coming up with how the questions were written, to like all of those elements to actually getting the product out there, running surveys with Kano analysis and things like that. So like there was a series of backlogs to actually execute, to even get to enough to even then formulate a product. You can 100% do that with Kanban and manage that product process. Some of it all just comes back down to like work breakdown. How do you break these things down into logical sequences of things to kind of push things forward? That's always the biggest problem when it comes to like starting a new product, is like, I've got an idea, but if you're starting a product that potentially is in the healthcare space, do you know all the regulations for like CFR 21 part 11, or like the FDA guidelines for software as a medical device? Probably not. But like there's a lot of these discovery elements that like regulations in the US, I don't know if people are here from like different countries, but there's significant regulations when it comes to like healthcare product development and innovation and like what you can do. So like even some of that research that you can do, you can really shoot yourself in the foot with some of these experiments if you don't have like the right risk and controls folks in there. So like if you're in like new product discovery, you better have a friend that knows that. You better have access to um, good legal counsel, because there are things that get you into a lot of trouble.
Well, and I think just thinking about the concept of MVP as it relates to work in the discovery process, the other piece of this goes back to what we were talking about earlier around batch size, right? So if it's MVP, we're trying to keep things as small as possible. And so I think this also just comes back to how you're defining your experiment. How do you write a great experiment where you're getting it to be as specific and as small as possible so that it's moving through your product discovery Kanban quickly, but also helping inform the smallest piece of scope to go implement. And I mean, that's good practice no matter what kind of process you're using, I think, is to try to keep things and keep that scope as small as possible. You'll be more accurate in your estimates, you'll be more accurate in your forecast if the scope of both the experiment and the scope of MVP stays as small as possible.
Oh, and that's
I'm seeing,
100%
yeah,
true.
go ahead.
But like sometimes, like you may be able to just release a feature. You may be able to start your whole entire product with just one feature. It's like people that like there, it just depends on like your market and what problem you're trying to solve. So like your MVP could literally be one feature that can be accessed from like a web page or like your mobile app. And that could be your MVP. Bare bones. Um, we've seen people launch loan origination platforms or like personal loans where like they literally released like a single web page that said, "Hey, if you're interested in personal loans, we've got great rates. Call this number." And literally all they had in the back end was like the FDR processing platform and like five people sitting in a room typing directly into the machine. So like their product launched off the ground with five people in a really crappy web page. And then it obviously got better and more account management features and things like that as time went on. But
Well, and I think the other trap people get stuck in with MVP is we push out an MVP and we assume that everything that's going to follow out, all these other features we may think are important are automatically going to happen after MVP. So I think it's equally as important too when we think about throwing away those experiments or throwing away or not moving that work forward, that we're doing the same thing from an MVP perspective based on that data coming in. I'm seeing a bunch of questions about estimates and forecasting. I want to jump to that in a moment, but before we move away from the concept here of MVP and how we can use data to help drive that decision making, I see a question from Daniel around what metrics we're tracking the most and why. Would you share some feedback on that, James?
so like when we track metrics, like there is the pure like delivery side of it. So like that's one of those hard questions. Um, everything that you are trying to discover could require its own unique set of metrics. So like what outcomes are you driving to? For me, it's more about having those clear outcome metrics defined. Like what is that outcome we are trying to achieve with these products? And what does failure look like? As much as it is important to define those metrics, defining what success and failure of your discovery um, is extremely important. Like so if I'm, I always go back to when we're talking about business outcomes to that Kennedy quote around, I believe by the end of this decade, we should put a man on the moon and return him safely. Like, see, there was that qualifier there. We got to bring him back safely. But like, if you're in a large company, like, are they setting like deterministic targets for you? Or are they giving you an outcome and you're able to come back and then kind of tell them like, here's what we believe that the outcomes should be. This is how we're going to move towards the organization's strategic vision. And then here are the metrics that we are going to do to bring that. So like if if you want to bring, I don't know, financial advice to, a, a magnitude of folks, well, what experiments are you going to run this year to move that needle towards, that target state goal of, whatever that is. And that's the types of metrics that we would want to focus on. But then you need to also focus on, are we delivering it as, predictably, cost effectively, predictably as we can.
Yeah, and I think if we're talking specifically product discovery metrics, it kind of depends on if it's net new products or like you were talking about feedback on existing products. So the maturity of the product, I think, impacts the types of things that you're going to measure. I've found when I'm trying to rate out the metrics for an experiment, I usually look to the pirate metrics, if anyone's familiar with those. So it's, see if I can do it off the top of my head. It's called pirate metrics because it's AAARR. So I think it's activation, acquisition. Let's see if I can come up with the other one. Maybe somebody can drop them in the chat. Retention, referral. I'm missing an A or I'm missing an R. I'm not sure. But those are great ones to look at too when you're defining your experiment and what kind of targets you want to hit. And the curve for what you're tracking there is going to depend, like I said, on the maturity of what you're experimenting on. So let's talk there's some questions here around estimates, and I think we're probably venturing a little bit more into the delivery side. Tim Nolan asked, do you find that estimates are better with teams that have worked longer together? And I think there's probably two parts to this question, right? Are we estimating Are we asking the team for those estimates, or are we using forecasting and using past data to be able to do some probabilistic forecasting on when things will be completed? I would say, I tend to look less at team stability and more at system stability for how accurate forecasts are going to be. So things like, are we keeping a consistent amount of work in keeping WIP consistent tends to matter almost more from a forecasting perspective. Now, that's where estimates is maybe a slightly different question around, are you asking the team for those estimates, or are you using past data to forecast? What do you think, James?
I am a system stability kind of person myself because Heidi Van Helfen wrote the book called Dynamic Reteaming. I think in this world, especially if you're in a larger company that promotes like that transient, like, hey, you stay in a role 18 months and then you should be moving on to your next gig. Um, and they encourage you to just hop around the company like every 18 months. You're never going to have a stable, consistent workforce, especially even with the job market and kind of the lack of US development talent. So like that's why I gravitate towards the system over like the physical teams themselves. Um, and Heidi's book does give a lot of great strategies there to kind of really combat a lot of that kind of ever shifting landscape of teams.
Yeah, and especially at this level, right? So when we're talking about that discovery work, I've seen some organizations where the members or the people running the experiments and managing things in the product discovery Kanban change over the course of what's happening with the work. So if it's a product owner who's looking upstream to say, what am I going to be working on next? They may not be working on products that are in delivery right now. Um, and that's where the team at a discovery level is, I think, often changing membership. And so looking at system stability of your product discovery team is going to be more focused on what's our capacity to run those experiments, who's managing them, who's managing the work on the board, and are we keeping that WIP consistent. And you talked about cost too, James, like the cost of running these experiments might be the factor for you of what your optimal operating capacity is. So it might not necessarily be people count. It could be what's our budget for running experiments that's driving your WIP limits for a product discovery team.
It's 100% valid.
It looks like we've got another question from Richa here. Do you use any EBM-based metrics, so evidence-based management metrics, to measure value delivered?
I haven't personally used it for that type of for that level. We've used it for agile transformation work. So I mean, it's bringing the best of like the lean kata and like progression through like transformation, cultural shifts, things like that. So like being able, that's primarily where I've used it. I haven't had an opportunity to use it in the product space, but I can see how it'd be super valuable.
Yeah. And Josh Barcombe, is this to try to find a business core competency? It's an interesting question. So you mean, I'm assuming we're talking through the product discovery process. I feel like you certainly could use it for something like that. So if you're doing experimentation here with your customers or potential customers to try to understand what they need, what they want to buy, what they want to pay for, I think it could tie to your core competency as a business. What have you seen around that, James?
It, your discovery can definitely dictate kind of your pursuit or ability to find those core competencies. Companies that try to be good at everything generally are good at nothing. So trying to pick a target direction, try to pick a market fit, like that is, you need the ability to have like that direct kind of market understanding and where is your product positioned kind of in that space. If you're like net new groundbreaking and the market is yours and untapped, it's one thing, and you potentially are always on top until somebody comes to eat your lunch. So your market fit is going to be tremendous. But if you're trying to break in to investment management, in this market, between the Schwabs, the Fidelity. Like Robinhood had to come in with like a pretty interesting kind of perspective to start trying to steal people away from the financial um, areas. So like it does potentially dictate where your fit is.
Well, we're down to our last 10 minutes here. James, give us your closing thoughts on this. What do you think are the biggest benefits of applying Kanban for product discovery?
Well, when I look at this whole kind of product discovery standpoint, and it could just be me, I'm always trying to look at the cost of the organization and kind of balancing those elements of it. Because if you don't treat your company like a business, or if you're in a larger company, actually having people understand like total cost of ownership, like that is a problem. So like when I'm looking at these from a product discovery standpoint, I do treat it like a startup. My perspective is if I can get everybody to think about the financial impacts of their decisions, um, it then helps you have a better conversation around how is the system performing. Because if you can see how much money you're wasting and that you're not going to get to that back half of your roadmap that you thought you really wanted to do because you ran out of money, it's important for people to know that. Like fiscal responsibility is super important. Uh, Visualizing your work, understanding the is 100% important with discovery work. It does help drive accountability. It does help organizations. Like if a lot of the folks that are involved in your upfront discovery or like in flight discovery process, if you're resource constrained there and they're more of a shared service, not having these things visible and displayable on a Kanban board is really setting that group at a disadvantage and disservice, because they won't truly be able to manage their demand and capacity, and you really won't know how many people you have or don't have, and then these people end up burnout, they end up overworked because the pace of business doesn't stop. So making sure that you're like this is one of those effective techniques to really truly help those types of organizations really keep themselves from being burnout. It helps bring more visibility to discovery work. I think people also need to really not be afraid to kind of put discovery in at multiple levels of the portfolio. Like the fact that, we have OKRs come in and like people want to do these big initiatives and set these yearly goals. If you're in a larger company, making them actually go through it, some level of discovery before it even becomes a potential OKR. Is this even a good idea to start? Like, is this something we should really be chasing this year? Like, have it at all levels of your portfolio, because eventually that person, like people on the team level, are eventually going to have to scope out potentially cost, scope, all that nonsense of the initiatives or larger bodies of work turn into. Well, that's going to take capacity away from your development teams. So kind of pushing discovery through all levels of your portfolio for these work, even if it's not true product discovery, like the management and visibility of like at least validating that this is a good idea throughout your portfolio is going to help protect your teams actually delivering the work. And don't be afraid to try things. Like I talked about earlier at the beginning around an AA process, like experiment, like see what if that does work for you, see what kind of insights you can get out of that. Or I mean, technically, like if you're using a product like Lean Kit, which is now Agile Place, I wonder if that turns into that rally branding problem when they went to. I digress. Um, but they do like it captures rework. So it's less important about your workflow being linear because it can go back and forth, and it will capture the amount of rework in your system. And then you can then see like the circular nature of that process and how much that actually built into your cycle time. So it doesn't kind of erode your flow metrics. But if you're working out of Jira and you don't have an easy BI wizard sitting in your corner, it breaks actionable. So don't actionable breaks with the backwards flow. So at least the item aging, the total time will work. But um, you really need to be able to also think about some of your tools and your ability to visualize this. And if you're not making, tick marks on a sticky note, how do you actually implement this in the tools to bring that visibility?
Yeah, yeah. Stephen called out item aging as well here, and I think you can keep this probably a lot more simple to track your work item age than even Jira probably makes it with the dots and stuff. I usually just have the team put the start date in front of the ticket title so that we can see all the start dates on each card from the top level view of the board, and then that way you can drive that conversation around where is work stuck or aging unnecessarily on the board.
100%.
Well, we're gonna wrap this up for today. There's still some great questions in the chat, and please check out all of our past episodes on YouTube. All of the previous episodes are posted there. Next month, we'll be talking about Kanban for SAFe. And so while you may know some elements of Kanban that are applied to the Scaled Agile framework, we're going to do a deeper dive into how you could potentially make that better and make different levels of your SAFe implementation more effective by leveraging Kanban practices. So thanks everybody for joining us today. Great conversations in the chat. James, thanks so much for sharing your experiences with everyone here today. And if you're interested in learning more about estimating based off of past data and probabilistic forecasting, you can check out ProKanban.org's Applied Metrics for Predictability, or as James mentioned, applying scaled portfolio Kanban classes as well. So learn more, and thanks all for joining us today. You'll find this episode on our YouTube channel later this afternoon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.